In this week's episode, a new era of the Porsche 911 arrives. Has endurance racing become the best motor racing for the spectator? And why can't the fuel system on my Porsche 924 just work? It's another Witty 924. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel, and yes, we are back on the podcast after what must be about 6 or 7 months. So apologies there. I've tried to keep the content regular on the YouTube channel, so that's been ticking along nicely, but the podcast has suffered slightly. So we're going to put the gloves on and try and get this thing ramped up again over the summer period. I have to say that I've been pretty busy, not just tinkering with the cars as usual, but actually getting them out to a number of shows. So this year already we've done the great collecting cars coffee run at Bicester. That was superb. Just thousands and thousands of great cars and people to talk with. So if you haven't checked out or been along to one of those before, then you should definitely try it out. It's a really, really good day out. Sun was glorious as well, which always helps, obviously, with that type of event. Also managed to get the car down to Goodwood's for Super Sunday, and that as well. I've done these previously, I think probably 3 or 4 years ago now, but this one, it was just rammed. It's almost like everyone's sort of been waiting and gearing up ready for the sort of summer of 2024, and it's going off with a bang, as they say. So it's been a fantastic sort of start to some of the great car shows. And the Goodwood Super Sunday did not disappoint. Some spectacular cars down there, not just the usual supercars, but they had a host of hypercars, some that you just don't, generally get to see in the flesh. So it brought in the droves, so lots and lots of people there. I managed to take down the 996 Turbo, stretch its legs. It was brilliant. Like, I love driving that car. It's so much fun. And still amazes me that we're allowed cars of sort of that power just to blast around on public roads, but hey, that's what it is. It was a great day, very sunny, and yeah, if you haven't been to these sort of things, I do encourage you to check it out. It's a morning generally well spent meeting lots of great people and seeing some spectacular cars. So on to today's topics of the podcast, and we will start with the Porsche 911. And in itself, an amazing story, right? I think you only have to look through the history books to see the humble beginnings and to where it is today. And today is an interesting point in its, I guess, evolution. Some may say a revolution in some respects as well. But the car, I guess, is going through that moment in time where all cars have to consider what the fuel and the powertrain will look like for the future. And the model in this respect is the 992.2. So the 992 has been around for a while now. They always do these, what I would call halfway house iterations. So they launch the new model. They learn lots about it, not just from their own testing before the launch, but as customers feedback through the ownership experience, through the dealerships and all of the various ways in which these cars are used, you gather obviously lots of information which can help iterate maybe the next updates of the car. And in this case, they always have what is a .1 and then followed by a .2, usually a few years later. This is the 992.2, as I mentioned. And what's interesting about this particular car is it's sort of the moment in time where Porsche had to really start thinking on the direction of the 911 in terms of its fuel and I guess powertrain in many respects for its future. Now, many companies that we've seen and heard in the news have rushed off onto the horizon with, we're going fully electric. I think you could look at the other side of that coin, where you look at companies like Toyota, who've been very, I would say not reserved, but probably more aware that not everything needs to switch overnight like a light switch and suddenly everything's electric, because I think there's a big discussion about how that happens from every scenario and every angle of, you know, how people use cars in their life. So I think they were quite clever in that they gave choice across their range. And I think Porsche are also being very considered in their approach, not just from the 911, but also across their range. So they still have obviously internal combustion engines in their ranges, but they've slowly but surely looked at the different models and started to consider the different ways that these might be offered to their customer base, and ultimately giving choice to their customer base. So it's at that moment now for the 911, and they have included the hybrid version within the vehicle and started to think about, okay, what does this mean potentially as a platform that could be electric for the future, what type of fuels it might run on. And I think because it is the flagship model of the Porsche brand, it's very important that they get this right and don't, in many respects, mess it up and cause any sort of not just damage to the brand, but also to the customer base, who are very, very passionate about what the cars mean, what they use them for, how they interact with them, and all those elements that have built this iconic shape and, you know, car in its own brand over the last 50 plus years. So it's very, very important that everything is very well balanced and considered as they go through this journey. So from that perspective, the launch of the car has been quite interesting. There's various comments on that. There's videos and so on, which I won't go into, but it's worth having a look at. But what is interesting is they've published, and I'll go through some of the highlights of this. They've published sort of the 13, maybe unlucky for some, but it's sort of the 13 things that you need to know about what the 992.2 has included in terms of its sort of next iteration of the vehicle, the 911 itself. So first one right up there, which we sort of touched on, is the hybrid tech itself. So it's it's interesting, right? So they've launched the car with the GTS model. I don't think there's anything to read into that. I think there's lots of discussions around which models usually get launched first and so on. I think they've got reasons for all of this, but without sort of getting sidetracked too much with that, I think what's interesting is that they've redeveloped a 3.6 litre flat six engine with an electric exhaust turbocharger, as they call it, which builds faster boost pressure for better acceleration. And they align it to the 919 hybrid racing car, which was very iconic in endurance racing, which we'll touch on a little bit in a moment. So you remember, in many respects, this test platform of racing for many manufacturers was the place that you could really start to consider how you might develop technology that would ultimately find its way into road cars. And this is a great example, right? So the hybrid, I guess, learnings that they've gone through with the 919 over those years of racing endurance has helped them develop something that they really think is right for the 911 and for the customer, and to ensure that it's following this track of all of those various things that are, from a compliance perspective, be emissions, how you power your vehicles of the future, and so on, are aligning to that sort of that narrative around them as a manufacturer of road cars. So from that perspective, that's a big one. They've also got this, what they call a T-Hybrids Lite compact 400 volt traction battery, and it's a bit of a mouthful, but I think in short, you've got a battery that is sort of helping out in terms of storing energy and this isn't necessarily something we've not heard about before. Regen braking and stuff like that is something that's been around for quite a while. But it's just starting to pepper in these technologies into what traditionally has always been a internal combustion engine that's been at the heart of the 911, and the experience in which you have with that engine, be it through a manual or PDK gearbox, has sort of been the enthusiast's calling card, right? That's what we've always loved about that particular car. We've always talked very much about how the setup around all of that, creates this perfect driving experience in many respects. So with these new technologies coming in, it's really important that they're brought in a way that makes the experience still feel like you are connected to this machine that has always sort of been the mantle for the ultimate experience of driving. So I think there's going to be interesting thoughts about how that plays out over the coming years, and what the car might adopt in terms of future technologies. But it's its first step, right? And it's quite a big step, because, as I said, it's such an iconic car, it's such an iconic brand, and its history. The company sort of built its brand around this particular model, so it's important. There is obviously, as I said, this interesting split of engines as well, where you tend to find that companies are sort of settling maybe on one engine and then have lots of variants of power from that one particular engine. So you will see, a range of the VW group do this really well, right? Which obviously Porsche is a part of, but they'll produce a 2-litre engine, and then they'll start from maybe 150 horsepower or 200, and then it can go right up to maybe 300 plus or so on. There'll be different iterations for different models. So I think what's interesting here is that they've launched the car with a 3.6 engine, but there's also going to be a 3-litre flat six. So it's interesting that they're still sort of providing that choice for customers to engage with. There is the interesting but I think highly accepted technology of rear axle steering that has a huge amount of benefits. Certainly when you talk about low speed maneuverability, I think that now has become standard on the GTS. So that is something that will be no doubt on the tick list for a lot of people speccing those types of cars. Next is the PDK. Very, very cool and very fast gearbox. So they've done a few tweaks as expected. I think there's a little bit of a tweak on 7th and 8th, which give you more of an overdrive in terms of a ratio, just to help on cruise when you are, sort of on long journeys and stuff. But ultimately help with your fuel efficiencies. But there's also an electric motor that's now integrated into the PDK, and this is where some of the torque uplift is happening at low speeds. But equally, they are doing the recuperation around a dynamo to convert what they call mechanical energy into electrical energy there. So that's quite a big step there. Next up is some key chassis changes. First of all is new engine mountings. Next is quite an interesting statement that they've put here, but they say a completely revised chassis. That's quite a big statement, isn't it? Completely revised. Maybe that's something we need to dig into a little bit later, maybe in some future podcasts. But they're saying it is around accommodating the even wider wheels. And I think something around the size of the 911 has always sort of been in the back of my mind, as with many enthusiasts. I look at my 996 and it's got the wide body sort of back end, and I think, wow, that's really nice, but it's still quite a small frame around in which you sit and drive ultimately on the very slim line roads of the UK. But as you got to sort of 991 onwards, the car just started growing massively, didn't it? And to sort of say, hey, 992.2, we're going to get bigger, and by the way, there's bigger wheels. So I think, well, how much bigger can they go? I'm sure, yeah, I'm sure they could probably go bigger, but it's, it's pretty interesting, that one. There's a slew of electronic aids around the car, of course. PDV, Porsche Torque Vectoring, PDCC, Porsche Dynamic Chassis Control, PASM, Porsche Active Suspension Management. That one has a little bit of interesting addition in terms of its feature. It has what they're calling electronically controlled stability, which aids cornering. So I'm not sure if it's similar to how McLaren's use the suspension to control the roll of the car electronically. That could be something I probably need to have a little more of a dig around on that one. The next area of the update I think is going to be the most widely debated amongst enthusiasts, and that is the full digitization of the cockpit. So as a driver, you are now presented with a 12.65-inch curved display. And the interesting thing is that the rev counter, which was always this analog display that was presented to the driver, carried such meaning, I guess, for a 911 owner. It was sort of it bucked the trend of all other cars, of all other designs and makes, because it was very personal to the 911 for a whole host of reasons. But to have that now as this almost blank digital screen, as you get in, this is the first thing you interact with in many respects. Obviously the materials around you, the touch, the feeling and stuff, but when you turn something on and spring it to life, you are presented with a screen and not what was these sort of beautifully laid out, even almost like timepiece like display dials that were very analog, that sort of followed the life and the journey of the 911. So we'll wait and see, and I guess we'll be involved in many debates about whether it's a good and a positive step forward in terms of the experience as a driver. The next on the list is the two-seater as standard option. It's an interesting one, because I think, again, this is one of those iconic areas around the 911. It is, in many respects, a two-seater sports car, but you have these two little, almost bucket-type seats that are directly behind, and in many cases, anyone who is of normal size with the seat back, like, no one's fitting into those rear seats. And you might argue that, small children would be a good fit for those seats, but in some cases, depending on their height and weight and various road rules, you might not be able to comfortably sit them in there. So there's the view that it's like a little bit of added storage is great, and it's going to be one of those areas that I think people do like the thought that it's sort of a four-seater, but it never really gets used as a four-seater, if at all, right? So I think if you are speccing one of these, you're probably more likely to add it back in as an option rather than having it as a two-seater. I think it's probably best for resale as well, just because we're so used to having those back seats. It's only the very, very sort of high-end, almost track-like versions like the GT cars that tend to not have the back seats. So the advice there, keep them in, spec them. Next up is new brakes, and they're calling these powerful aluminium monoblock fixed caliper brakes. So make of that what you will. The calipers are finished in red and also available in black, although the picture here has yellow ones, so I'm sure they will be able to do various different colour ones on the different models as you go to spec your car. They also have what are very cool, what they're calling switchable brake ventilation channels in the underbody, and I'm sure this is connected to the 5 what they call dynamic moving flaps at the front of the car. Now, these are, they call them sort of variable vertical cooling air flaps is the term they use here, but they open and close depending on the cooling required for what looks like the radiators and the right and left hand side of the bottom of the front bumper. And I guess those will also channel air or help with air supply through to the brake system as well. So it looks pretty cool, to be fair. I quite like the design of the flaps. I'm not sure, they don't state at when or how they open, whether it's speed related or heat related. So I'm sure there'll be some elements that we will find out more about as the sort of car comes online. But yeah, I quite like that. And of course, like with any of sort of supercars, your radiators tend to be sort of the front line or in the firing line for stones that find their way into the various channels of the rads, potentially can cause leaks, splits and so on. So I think if there's anything that can direct them in a way that stops that happening, so those flaps being open closed, I don't know, it might be it might help in the longer term, but we'll have to wait and see. Next on the list is the highlights, what they're calling a much sharper character, more clean lines, a muscular rear section, should I say. I'm muddled up there. I think there's some nice smoothing off of the rear end that maybe wasn't, in total favour with everyone in the 992.1, but it looks nice. I can't say that there's anything that sort of stands out to me as that's an eyesore. I think they've done some nice subtle upgrades there. The number plate position is much more intuitive now, so I think you'll get to see how the various colours that the car comes in will show off the various proportions and design features of the car, like all colours do. Next is a salute to the Cabriolet, and yes, the Cabriolet has a faster roof, apparently. So it can now fold in a mere 12 seconds via a button in the car or by remote control, so that's quite interesting. Usual bits around fixed glass rear screen. They talk about an integrated magnesium elements, making the actual roof much more lightweight but robust, which is expected. And also the iconic roof system of the 911 Targa also features a built-in roll bar. So that's everything around the Cabriolet versions. Next up are the lights. There's a new Matrix LED headlight now for the 911, which I think we would all agree the new lighting elements and systems that are now available on new cars are fantastic. When I think about my little 924 with its little candles, it's like literally can't see anything at night. The cars of today are fantastic, so it's virtually daylight, isn't it, with these new LED headlights. So the Porsche headlights still have the iconic 4 dots, as they call them, the 4 modules. They have 64,000 camera control pixels, whatever that means. But it basically suggests that when you're driving, they do everything that is required for the driver to see the most optimal areas of the road. So you don't have to touch the controls. They're automatically dimming. They brighten, they turn left and right and so on. So it's all those things that you expect from a great driving experience of your 911 when you're driving at night time. Next up is the tech section of the car, and this is where I think we are probably experiencing some of the biggest transformation as drivers. Not so much with what is presented in terms of electronic gizmos and gadgets, it's more of the electronic aids that help us drive, and I think this is where a balance is really, really important. There's a lot of what I would call angst amongst drivers of not calling it sort of a nannying type approach, but there is a lot of aids that are starting to creep in and almost not overrule, but just make you aware they're there, if that makes sense. I've got it even on my little GTI Polo, where you are on a lane, which is maybe a country lane where the white lines aren't completely visible, and the car will start to maybe just nudge you. It's not necessarily a forceful nudge, but it just sort of reminds you that it's there and to say, hey, hope you concentrate and sort of thing. It's quite an interesting feel if you've not gone through that experience before with these more modern cars. So these systems, these assistants or aids are prevalent now as a part of many rulings around European law, and so they are included. And of course, most of them can be turned off to some level and some degree, but it's just something to be aware of. I think this is another one of those great debate talking points that enthusiasts will no doubt highlight as something that's destroying the driving experience, and so on and so on. So, of course, there's a lot of great tech that's included, and some of it good, some of it maybe a little bit annoying. If it comes with a bing or a bong, then of course that can be highly annoying. Next up is the hydraulic lift, which can be deployed across any of the 911s, which is great to see. I think for UK roads in particular, I think this is it's a very, very useful and I think welcomed addition to any 911. The cost of these cars, you want to sort of ensure that you're not grounding out on horrible roads, which there are many of. Even when you go to these meets, there's some great places that you can meet, but sometimes the entrances to these meets aren't the best, right? And it'd be just, it's a peace of mind to know that you can raise the front of your car up before, scratching or grounding out the underneath trays of these cars. And as I mentioned earlier, some of these have got active aero going on. You certainly don't want to damage that if it's underneath the vehicle. So the option of a hydraulic lift, I think, is a welcomed addition. Brings us to the end of the 13 things you need to know about the new Porsche 911 992.2. It's quite a story, isn't it? The old 911 and all the iterations and understanding where they all fit and what years and what evolution and upgrade and so on. I mean, it's a story in itself, as I said at the beginning. And if you haven't read the story, or if you haven't sort of delved into it, there's some fantastic books out there actually that give you sort of where the humble beginnings of the 911 started and how it, evolved over the years. So with that in mind, the next question as we wrap up is, how attractive is this new car to potential new customers, be it existing customers of Porsche or customers that are not a Porsche brand owner today and considering what the new updates on the 992.2 are? Is it enough to turn their head towards the Porsche brand? Is it enough to maybe start people considering this 911 model and its new updates as a new ownership experience? So I think that's going to be the test, and the sales figures will give us that marker of success in the next 12 months. So, on to the world of motor racing, and in particular the endurance racing series that seems to have exploded over the last few years. If you're not a fan of motor racing, or you don't have too much knowledge or insight into the world of motor racing, then I encourage you really to look at endurance racing, because there is so much more going on than what initially meets the eye, if that makes sense. I think everyone is very well versed in Formula One. What do I mean by that? It's in the headlines, right? It's out there. It's got a massive media engine behind it that constantly pushes out information about Formula One. So whether you're a follower or interested in Formula One, it's always there, right? It's on the news, and so its visibility is very prominent. However, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's always a great spectacle for the spectator. And I think over the last few years, there's grumbles, maybe that's the best way to put it, that have really sort of wrapped themselves around Formula One and started to make people feel like it's not actually delivering a great spectacle as a spectator. And these things are not cheap to go to, right? You go to any of the races around the world, they are a considerable amount of money to enter. Many of them can be over, a number of days. So if you want to do the sort of whole package, if you want to add corporate hospitality and all that, these things can get pretty expensive as well. So you expect for your money value, right? And if you don't get the value, then you sort of think, well, why have I taken the time out of my calendar, out of my diary to come and see this thing that actually ends up being pretty mundane? Now, obviously, I'm not doing this, a great disservice. I think it's quite commonly known that in the years where one single driver dominates, and we've seen that with Michael Schumacher, we've seen it with Hamilton, and now Verstappen, there comes a moment or a tipping point where the series starts to lose its attraction, right? Because you sort of turn up and potentially watch this race wherever it might be happening in the world, and you sort of feel like you know the result before it's happened, right? And that's where sort of Formula One has been with the Verstappen era, as you might want to call it. But of late, I think in line with that, there's been the rise of endurance racing. And why has that happened? Well, I think there's two driving factors behind it. One, endurance racing has developed ruling that has price capped the entry to the highest level of the series. So let's call them hypercars for the moment. There's two sort of versions of that, but we won't go into too much detail. So the hypercar series. And coupled to that is the rise and support of manufacturers. And this is really important because when manufacturers put their time, effort and focus into a racing series, it will also attract the best drivers. And when you have the best drivers, the best manufacturers, focus, investment, you then are creating what is potentially the best racing series. You wrap that around with racing series that have races that last up to 24 hours, and suddenly you start to see what emerges is this fantastic platform for the spectator. Because to race a car or to drive a car very fast is hard enough. To race a car on tracks that are some of the most demanding tracks in the world, so Le Mans is an example of that. Daytona is another example. There's other ones that we'll touch on in a moment. You start to realize that this coming together of all these elements will produce something truly spectacular for the spectator. The last time you could argue this type of thing happened where all the right elements came together was when the Group C series was running back in endurance in the 80s. And of course, a lot of us remember that. Likewise, the Group B rallying, another iconic era of where these elements come together and you create these magical moments within the motorsport arena. So I think we are at one of those points where we have all the right ingredients. And what has happened over the last 2 years, specifically with the emergence of the hypercar series, is you've started to see more and more manufacturers getting to this series. It's dragging along some amazing drivers, and they are racing these cars in some of the best places in the world, some of the best tracks in the world. And it is creating a fantastic spectacle for the spectator. And not only are you watching racing that is very cleverly thought out from a strategic perspective, because there's so much going on that you might not be aware of unless you're really, into the racing and deep into understanding maybe the strategies around tires, the strategies around fueling, the strategies of how teams and the pairings work, and how various, and certainly in endurance racing, how various elements of the track that might have lots of traffic because they tend to race with other classes, and in particular GT3 class. So all these ingredients together really does bring together some magical racing. And if you haven't watched it, I'll give you some sort of highlights that I see. You look at Daytona 24 this particular year, you had the top three teams after 24 hours of racing separated by a mere sort of 10 seconds, which is insane to think, with pit stops, driver changes, fueling strategies, traffic amongst the other competitors that are racing in different classes, night and day, heat and cold in terms of track temperatures and so on. all of these elements play together over a period of time for what is a magical spectator viewing, right? It really is, because you really don't know who could potentially win the race until the last, well, I would say 30 minutes, maybe even less. It's that crazy. Now, of course, the one thing I haven't mentioned is if you have incidents, you hope there's not major incidents, because obviously you want everyone to stay safe and sound. But if there are incidents, most likely will be, because of how close and how competitive the racing is. You can have cars that, have built fantastic leads suddenly just wiped out, and we've seen that in some of the scenario races this year. I mean, the Iron Dames had a great lead in the last race at Spa, which was the 6 hours of Spa, and it's just those twists and turns for a spectator watching really does give you like the enjoyment and keeps you on the edge of your seat, because you just don't know what is going to be happening from lap to lap. And the racing is so close. The cars are always close. There's always traffic that they have to get through. And if you enjoy sort of that competitiveness lap after lap after lap, where, someone isn't just running away with the race every time you sit down and watch a race, then I really recommend endurance racing. And of course, there's huge amounts of history steeped in some of this stuff. So I'm at Le Mans, actually leaving this week for it, and we just did the 100 years last year of Le Mans. It's got so much history, it's got so much buzz around it, and the arrival of the hypercar series with the manufacturer backing is just elevated everything to new levels. The excitement for the race, the build up, starts weeks in advance. It's just a fantastic thing to see. And of course, at the heart of all of this, when we think about, put the racing aside, there's a lot of these great new technologies in hybrid that are being developed and pushed to the absolute limit by these racing drivers, which will ultimately find their way into our road cars in the coming years ahead. So I think from that perspective, it's always good that the manufacturers build upon the knowledge that they learn at these racing circuits. For us as spectators, it's great. And of course, a lot of these racing circuits that they go to aren't just sort of standalone, purpose-built. Some of them are steeped in masses of history. You can turn up and be there for, weekends, long weekends, the week prior and so on. And so you can build a whole experience around the race itself and be there, witness it and hear it. And of course, the sound level is always the important piece. It's what I guess motor racing has always had as its ace card in case, against any other type of sport, is the noise that you go to hear when these cars go past you. And I think, again, the hypercars have really brought that home. Some of the noises that are coming out of the hypercars are fantastic to hear. I think the one that springs to mind, most people would be talking about right now, is the Cadillac. I think they've managed to really capture like the essence of a true racing car sound. It's got this gut-wrenching feel as it goes past at top speed. If you happen to be on any of the corners where it's accelerating out, you just got this brilliant burble that comes out of the back end of the exhaust. And likewise, the new Ford GT, I think that in the GT3 series, that's got a fantastic sound, as does the Lexus. So there's this range of different sounds that really sort of play on your senses as a spectator if you're there live. And I think testament to the endurance series, both the WEC and IMSA. So, you got the North America version and you got the sort of European World Series, and the teams that have managed to get the funding and the focus and the people behind them have really done great strides, and testament to the sport itself by really driving this forward. And I think when you see teams even like Lamborghini, like when was Lamborghini ever in endurance racing? If it was a very long time ago, way before I was around. But it just shows you like everyone is coming back. Porsche are back, Alpine are have two cars in there, Cadillac's there, BMW are back with they've got advertising all over Le Mans this weekend coming with M Power is back at Le Mans. I mean, these are iconic brands that really have put their money where their mouth is. So it's fantastic to see. So if you get a chance, please tune in, have a look. The other sort of top tip here and recommendation around endurance racing is they've been fantastic at getting all the races live and streaming onto YouTube in many respects. Or even if it's not live streaming on YouTube, you can go to their websites. They are generally streaming them there as well. But if you miss the race, they'll be on YouTube free of charge to watch. So again, just the accessibility is there, and they're really ramping that up. And as I said earlier, Formula One are very good at doing that, and that's why everyone's sort of aware of everything that goes on. But I think the endurance series have really ramped up and done a fantastic job. So get along, check it out, enjoy it, and please let me know what you think. Okay, everyone, we are on the home stretch, so hang in there. We're almost done. The last topic we're going to cover on this podcast is my fabulous Porsche 924, and it's the fuel system, of course. It's been the bane of the complete ownership experience of the 924. To be fair, I think it's a bane of most classic car owners, in particular around late 70s and into the 80s, and this is generally aimed at the CIS fuel system, so continuous injection system. They are temperamental at best, I think is probably the best way to describe it. There are quite a few component pieces within the fuel system that, if they are not working in harmony, then troubles occur. It's pretty simple, and when your car is knocking on the door of 41 years old, of course, there are going to be things that go adrift. So you spend a lot of time potentially chasing your tail on this stuff. And the point to make here is that you can't just plug in an OBD reader. There's nothing electronic that allows you to find the source of the issue. Plug and play, point, and there you go. The code says it could be X, Y, and Z. So you tend to find yourself chasing around the system from beginning to end to try and identify what part isn't optimal or what part might be failing. And it can cause a whole host of challenges. And this is generally what I've been through back and forth, up and down. If you ask a lot of 924 owners in general, I think they would experience similar issues. And I've got just to reiterate, I've got the 924 2-litre engine. So arguably the least powerful out of the engines that were available in the 924, but equally, I don't think it's necessarily a really bad engine. Many will argue the fact, and you can trace its roots right back to design by Mercedes, funny enough, and I've covered this on previous podcasts and so on, so I won't go there. But needless to say, the car has, I think, a healthy 125 brake horsepower. The car is I think 12 to 1300 kg, something around that, I guess, with liquids and persons in. It's in one person, so it goes okay, right? It can be revved up to sort of 5 to 6,000 RPM. I think it's just over 6. So you can really push it. And the car has run for as long as I have owned the car. The car has run very well in terms of its acceleration through the gears. It's a 5-speed box. So I've not really had too many issues in terms of its performance. And that leads me on to the current day where I've woken the car up out of winter. So generally I put it away for winter, under covers, start it, move it forward and back and stuff. Nothing too strenuous, and keep it off the salty roads, as they say, because I did a lot of work to the suspension and just wanted to keep that in tip-top condition. So this year it's developed a small misfire. Maybe misfire is the wrong word. I would say more of a hiccup during running. Tick overs seems to be okay. It's ticking over nicely at the idle speed of around 900 plus or minus 50, they say in the book. But overall, it seems to be ticking over nicely. There's a slight wobble on the engine, which I put down to maybe a little bit of wear and tear on the mounts, and of course it's documented out there that that can cause a slight hiccup in the engine. So aware of that, but I'm not too worried because the mounts aren't that bad in respect to their age. But when you're accelerating through the rev range, there is it's almost like a stalling type effect at slight RPMs. It's noticeable more towards the high end. So I've been racking my brains around whether it's the warm-up regulator or whether it's the fuel distributor unit itself, whether it's the air meter plate potentially just getting stuck slightly on the edges, because that can cause potentially a hiccup. There is obviously vacuum lines that there's not that many in this particular case on the 2-litre engine, but there is still vacuum lines that potentially could be leaking, and there might be a small leak there. There's the auxiliary air valve that might not be closing completely. So you can trace all of those round and round, like I said earlier, like chasing your tail. Or, there's even suggestions you might have a small blockage in the return fuel line back to the tank, which is possible, but I don't think that could be the cause because it's been running so well for so long. I've had the warm-up regulator off a number of times to check in and around it. I've rebuilt it, refurbished it. I've even done the adjustments on the warm-up regulator that they're quite well documented out there on various other brands as well, because like I said, a lot of cars from this era use this setup. So you can adjust what they call the warm side of the regulator, and then once you've adjusted the warm side, you can then adjust the cold side. And I've done the warm side to ensure that the regulator is totally closed when engine is reached normal operating temperature, so you shouldn't have any issues with the warm-up regulator once it's running. But there's still this hiccup, so I'm at a point now where I think it's most likely going to be the airflow meter. So I've got to double check the spacing around the plate itself just to make sure it's seated correctly and that it isn't getting stuck. Also, another final check on all vacuum lines to make sure there's nothing split or potentially out of place that I've missed. So yeah, the fuel pump's fine. That's firing up the way it should be. I've had a pressure test, so yeah, this is an interesting one as well, because the pressure test kit that you need to buy to test the CIS system comes with some foibles, I guess. The system has to have a connection to the top of the fuel distributor, and then that connects to the warm-up regulator, so it becomes a part of the fuel system between those two component pieces. That's the best way to describe it. And there is a switchable valve on the pressure tester. I've done a video on YouTube on this, so please check it out. There's some great comments actually from some of the followers and guys that have 924, so a big thank you to them for all the feedback and commentary as well, because I seemingly thought that I had connected the pressure test kit correctly, and then thought I hadn't correctly set it up, and I was getting readings that I just didn't feel confident were the correct ones, even though in some parts of the Haynes manual, for instance, it was stating figures I was getting. In other parts, it wasn't aligning to what I thought I needed, be it cold start, be it warm start, ambient air temperature, and all of those good things that go with it. So I changed the setup, and I had it one way, then I had it the other way. I was getting readings one way that felt more in line with what I was reading versus the ones previously. Anyway, long story short, I feel that I'm getting the right pressure through the car because it's ultimately running. It's running really well, but I just get this silly hiccup now and again that is very noticeable. So there is obviously something somewhere within the component pieces that isn't completely optimal. This is what I was saying. You end up just chasing your tail. So the pressure test kit has basically told me that I've got the right pressure to make the system work and fire and run, which is great. There doesn't seem to be any drop off. When you run it and then turn the engine off, there should be a back pressure that stays for a certain period of time, and I've got that, which means the accumulator at the back of the car, which sits after the fuel pump before the fuel filter, is doing the job it's meant to be doing. So yeah, it's a really difficult one. So the idea of trying to solve this yourself becomes a little frustrating. And of course, if you were to go to any local garage, most people won't want to touch this type of system because it's very old, of course, and maybe there might not be the experience within the garage you go to. And then if you do go to potentially a main dealer or a specialist, they too might have not the experience. There might be someone that used to work on the cars, 30, 40 years ago, and if they are there, fantastic. But then you are paying for their time. And of course, time is not cheap anymore. So you are going to be paying hundreds and hundreds of pounds for someone to potentially go through the same steps that you are, trying to fault find what the component piece is that's letting down the system. Now, my gut feel, my sort of point to component, I think, is going to be the warm-up regulator. I think that is the fault. And as much as you can do adjustments and that, if you haven't got it at its optimal, it will give you a bit of a problem, and that can be from cold start, warm running, and so on. So a lot of forums cover this, and everyone will suggest starting generally with the warm-up regulator, because it can be the most temperamental. And but even if you read the books and the manuals about this, they generally say that if it's past its optimal condition, it is just a replacement. Of course, back then it was easy to replace them because they were being produced in mass numbers because everyone was running them on all manufacturers and cars and so on. But nowadays that's not the case. So to find a reconditioned one that you trust has been set up completely correctly from the specs you need, or to the specs you need for your car, are very few and far between. So it's a bit of trial and error on that one. So I've tried as much as I can to go through the steps of adjusting as best I can, and I've got a final adjustment to do on the cold start side, and maybe that will level it out to a point where the slight hiccup will disappear. But that's the story, yeah. That's the fun and games of owning a car that's 41 years old, classic car ownership, being able to get your hands dirty on some of this stuff and learning about it is really why I bought this car. And to get a better understanding of how this stuff works is great, but equally to try and fault find and fix things yourself is a sense of achievement in many respects, and keeping the car running to its best, and enjoying that when you're out and about. So I've driven the car quite a lot this year. Again, as I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, I took that one up to Bicester Heritage. So nice 150 plus miles round trip, maybe a little more. And it blew through, right? There was no issues. It started, it ran, fuel economy was good. So again, maybe I'm just being nitpicking on this, giving it a tough time, but you can feel it, right? And when you can feel something, you just want to start investigating, and off you go down the rabbit hole, as they say. So anyway, so that's been the fun and games with the 924. I will continue to get involved in that and try and keep it running to the best it can. From that perspective, I've got some cool videos coming along actually with the front of the car. So finally got round to doing the new discs, new pads, and new wheel bearings. That's going to be published soon on YouTube. And got a few more things around, a little bit of the wiring of the car, some little bits of upgrade and stuff that very cool things to do for the summer ahead. But that's it from me in terms of the 924. I've enjoyed actually going through quite a few of these cool topics around the 992.2, World Endurance Racing, and of course my 924. Loads of other topics I'm going to be covering in the future episodes, and hopefully get a bit more regular, as I hope. But with that, thanks again for joining me. Thanks for spending the time here on the podcast with me. And please do, when you can, follow me on Instagram and check out the videos on YouTube. So until then, I will see you next time.